Hello, my friends, Hank here, and today we are going to talk all about how I made this, the largest scratch-built diorama I have ever attempted. Here, I'm hoping to recognize some of the fierce battles fought in the A Shau Valley of central Vietnam during the latter years of the Vietnam War, and I drew a lot of inspiration for this piece from the fighting on Hill 937, known most infamously as Hamburger Hill, in May of 1969. So, I'll take you through the process. This all begins, of course, with an idea. I'm going to put this down. Now, I've just finished up what's kind of become a yearly tradition of rewatching Ken Burns' phenomenal documentary miniseries on the Vietnam War, and I wanted to take a go at making a Vietnam diorama. Now, the tough thing with Vietnam War pieces, for me at least, isn't the vehicles or the figures, it's the foliage. Tropical and subtropical vegetation can be really hard to capture authentically in miniature. There's just so much going on in those thick jungles. But in episode 8 of Burns' series, they get into a lot of the fighting up in the A Shau Valley, and we really just get to see how devastated many of those mountaintops were from the conflict. Hill 937, for example, just looks like a moonscape. It's cratered, burnt, blasted, all to hell, splintered trees, truly awe-inspiring for all the most terrifying reasons. 56 Americans and 31 ARVN soldiers lost their lives trying to take this chunk of clay over the course of 8 days, and those images really stuck with me, and I decided that's what we're going to do. So, with our inspiration in mind, the first thing we've got to do is gather our supplies. Roger and I headed off on phase 1 of our mission to our local Home Depot to gather the bones of our diorama, so to speak. XPS foam insulation project panels work very well for diorama work, and we'll go through this in a bit here, but we grabbed 2 of these big guys. We also walked by this nice round baseboard and figured that might be helpful. Roger was way too excited by the birds flying around the store to make filming very easy, so the rest of our shopping experience wasn't very well documented, but we got everything else we needed from stop 1. After a quick pit stop for a pup cup at Dunk's, we headed down to the beach to requisition some sand for our texturing work. And we forged some sticks to use for our shattered tree line up on top of our replica Hill 937. We of course also did a little trick practice and some fetch because Raji was such a good assistant for the day. With the dogs sufficiently tuckered out and all of our materials gathered, it was time to head back home and get to work. Now, originally I wanted to use that wooden base as our pedestal of sorts. This did not end up working out, and we'll get to that later. But anyway, I started by tracing our first earth layer to the size of our base into the XPS foam. And then, using my foam hot wire cutter, I started to cut that circle out of the foam board. FYI, if you're trying to do this at home, this stuff stinks. Open the windows, light some candles, wear your respirator, apologize to your wife when she gets home. But here we can see that the first layer of the hill is looking pretty solid. So now I want to make a slightly smaller second layer to start building this thing up like a wedding cake. No real rhyme or reason here, these are really just artistic choices. I continued the process until I had a general shape that I was happy with for the diorama, and then I went around and traced and numbered all the pieces in order so I would be able to assemble everything properly. At this stage, I also decided I needed to add a little NVA tunnel, so I cut a couple of entrances in with the foam cutter as well. With our diorama skeleton designed, so to speak, it was time to start securing everything together. Using some Gorilla Glue spray adhesive, I started to stack the sections together as planned. This Gorilla Glue spray works exceptionally well for this, as it starts to break down the surface of the XPS foam and the individual pieces chemically bond together very quickly. With our foam segments all combined, I used some of these paint stirring popsicle sticks to craft a sort of basic roof structure for the tops of our tunnels. And these were also mounted with that same Gorilla Glue spray. For the next step, I took some of this expanding foam gap filler and started to create a sort of intermediate slope between each of our blocky foam layers. Using another one of our stirring sticks, I flattened some of the spray foam out so it wouldn't look as expandy. I don't really know how else to say that. Expanding foam doesn't look super natural, but anyway, once our forbidden icing was decently lathered all over our hill, it was time to step away and let it do its thing. Mrs. Bruce and I ate some dinner and watched an episode of Black Mirror, I think. Yes. So I gave this about 2 hours to settle, let's say. Returning to our nearly fully cured foam, I broke out a razor blade and started trimming off some of the excess spray foam once again to create a less marshmallowy exterior. Almost all of this will eventually be covered up, but I wanted our base to at least have a relatively organic texture. I also took this opportunity to hack away some craters and holes out of our XPS foam for a little additional character. And finally, it was time for our trees. Breaking out our bucket of foraged sticks, I went to work cutting, splitting, and hacking these all up to achieve a realistic bomb-shattered and burnt look. Another nice thing about using foam as a base, you can just stick the trees right into the foam. Easy peasy. After a while, Roger and I decided that we had a sufficient assortment of busted up plant matter on top of our hill. To wrap up the work for this first day, I mixed up a slurry of plaster of Paris and poured this all over our prepared base. This is obviously way wetter than what they call for on the box, but that's what I wanted. Moving around the diorama, I just made sure to coat the whole surface of the piece with some of the wet plaster. Once the plaster was poured all on there and it was still wet, I went ahead and sprinkled some of our beach sand all over the diorama to add some natural dirt texture. I also popped a few rocks here and there to add some additional interest to the piece. And finally, I went around the diorama and tossed some small splinters of wood into the wet plaster to serve as the tree fragments that we see scattered all over in reference photos and footage from the Battle of Hill 937. And with that, I left the plaster to cure overnight. Upon returning in the morning, we only had one little hiccup. The wooden base that everything was built up from warped like crazy overnight, probably because it absorbed a bunch of water from the plaster, but fortunately, the rest of the foam on upwards was totally fine. I just made the decision to remove the wooden bottom base layer. No harm, no foul. Since this piece was so big, I wasn't going to attempt to paint this with my airbrush, so I took the whole thing outside and tackled our initial painting work with spray cans. The first step was to prime the whole thing in black, which already is looking pretty good. And then I came back with this lighter tan nutmeg rust-oleum paint and started to paint on some of our earth tones. You can pretty much smell this footage. I still can. Spray paint. Stinky stuff. Anyway, after that aired out a bit, I came back inside and we headed into the studio to start our finer brush detail work. The whole finishing process for this piece was a really nice opportunity to just slow down, put on some music, and paint some sticks. Once again, no hard set rules here, just using pretty much every acrylic earth tone I have. I just moved around the landscape and painted these natural materials with browns and tans and greens and grays, being sure to lean on some of our reference footage for inspiration. After the trees were painted up, I broke out a few washes to add some dimension and variety to the groundwork itself. I mostly tackled this with Vallejo oiled earth, as well as a simple black wash that I mixed using some black primer and some water. I wanted this darker wash to help capture some of the really dramatic burnt-out effect you see in a lot of these hilltop images from Vietnam, where artillery and air support and napalm have quite literally burnt the landscape to a crisp. After all the washes were applied, it was time to break out our pigments. I first loaded up some of that iconic red Vietnam earth pigment and focused mostly on the exposed vertical portions of our hillside. My thinking here, as we learned in my previous video about Vietnam vehicle weathering, is that this red packed soil kind of behaves like clay and is densely packed deep into the ground. So when these hillsides are blown apart, the unburnt red rich clay is finally exposed to the surface. Always a good idea when you're trying to recreate any realistic diorama. Try and think about how the landscape would actually behave in real life. Alright, with our Vietnam earth pigments on there, I then busted out some lighter Europe earth to add a little contrast and some highlights to our dust work. And I finished that off with some deeper Russian earth soil for a little bit more variety. For a final touch before sealing in the diorama with some varnish, I went around with some cheap black paint and trimmed out the outside of the base to create a nice, clean, professional finish to the bottom of our diorama. At this stage, it was finally time to start sealing everything up. I initially took the whole diorama back outside to hit it with a coat of matte varnish from a spray can, but the finish was still way too shiny, so the trusty airbrush did finally make its way into the project, and I applied an extra coat of ultra matte varnish for our finishing pass. Now, at time present, I only have 2 completed Vietnam-era US figures that were ready to go for this diorama. I fully intend to add at least a couple more, plus probably 1 NVA fighter, but I wanted to get at least a couple figures on here to give an idea of how this is going to look. These guys can be placed and mounted with a bit of super glue, easy stuff. And with that, the diorama is complete. I really enjoyed this project. It was a wonderful learning experience for me to test out some new building materials. You guys know I mostly work on World War II era subjects, so this was also a step outside of my usual wheelhouse. But the piece looks really great. I'm really proud of it. I'm excited to add some additional figures to help tell this story. It's a beautiful addition to the studio down here, and it's going to be a fun one to bring to shows in the future. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this little run through of my process, and it can provide some inspiration for your own work. Thank you for tuning in, my friends, and until next time, be well, happy building. Cheers.